Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's this crowd is wonderful. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. And I have to say that because we have lots of people joining us from Zoom as well. So it's very cool. We are very pleased to have audiences both here and by Zoom. And for those of you in the theater, right? You've silenced all of your devices. They're not going to bark or chirp or, do anything. I see. No, you haven't, have you? Okay. But now I don't care if you vibrate. I just don't want noise. Okay. Now, those of you at home, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom menu when they cross your mind, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end. And I know our audience, I know there will be questions. There always are. But those of you who are here in the theater, if you would please wait until the microphone comes around, because if you're at home, you cannot hear the question. So it's really important to do that. Tonight's lecture is the second of a three-part series highlighting our current exhibition, Setting Sail, the Story of Sea Cloud. And the third and final lecture of the series will be given by Thomas Wu, and he is the curator of the exhibition. He will take us on a tour of the ship. Yes, I think it's going to be very cool. His presentation is on March 27th. So there are still tickets available, so be sure to visit the website and get your tickets if you don't already have them. And if you haven't seen the show, please be sure you do. It's really wonderful. Now, last week, I know there were some of you who were here last week. So wonderful, so wonderful. We learned about the role of the sea cloud in the Coast Guard and about some of the crew members on board, including the painter Jacob Lawrence. Well, tonight we're going to hear a lot more about Jacob Lawrence from Kimberli Gant, who will explore Lawrence's career following his time on the Sea Cloud. He had an illustrious career before the Sea Cloud, during the Sea Cloud, and after the Sea Cloud. So you'll really get a chance. You may have seen the Migration series at the Phillips Collection. That was before the Sea Cloud. And you've seen the two of the four that are extant from the Sea Cloud are in our exhibition. So I'm really pleased about that. And now you'll learn all about what happened afterwards. So please join us in the lobby for a book signing. The book, Black Orpheus, Jacob Lawrence, and the Mbari Club is available for purchase upstairs. It is a gorgeous book, Yale University Press. It is really a wonderful book. So go up and get it. But before I hand the microphone over, I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight. Kimberli Gant is the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. She was previously the McKennan Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, and has worked as the Mellon Doctoral Fellow at the Newark Museum and the director. She's not old enough to have done all of this. Director of exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art. She has curated numerous exhibitions and gallery installations, including Giants, art from the Dean Collection of Swiss Beats and Alicia Keys, Spike Lee Creative Sources, Journeys Across the Border, U.S. and Mexico, Tuan Andrew Nguyen, The Boat People, and Multiple Modernities. Now, please join me in welcoming Kimberli Gant to the podium.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Kate, for inviting me. I'm excited to be speaking about this project. It's been a couple of years since I worked on it, so it's nice to kind of connect with an old friend. And I'm excited to talk to you about, I think, a project or an aspect of Lawrence's life and career that a lot of people didn't know, and that kind of I didn't. So, and I'm going to also incorporate some of Lawrence's time in the Coast Guard as well, because even though I'm talking about his time in Nigeria in the 1960s, he really started his interest in the world as a visual storyteller much earlier. It began when he was a young man, later when he was a member of the Coast Guard, and then culminating in his desire to see the origins of modernity within African art. So Lawrence knew that by traveling the world, he could better present it in his paintings. And before I talk about that, I want to also just begin by talking about his practice and how I started thinking about this exhibition project. So, yeah, there's my title slide. Um, so, Black Orpheus Jacob Lawrence and Mbari Club is a project that I had begun when I was working as a graduate fellow at the Newark Museum of Art in 2015 to 2016. If you've not been there, please go. It's a wonderful institution. I was researching the museum's collection, which had several works by Lawrence. And I was examining his catalog raisonné, and there were two mirroring timelines. And I don't know if you are familiar with the catalog raisonné. I would highly recommend purchasing it because as far as and people can correct me, but other than I know that Romiri Bearden's foundation is working on one. But as far as I'm aware, Jacob Lawrence is the only African American with a catalog raisonné. And I always mention that in these presentations to remind us of the importance of scholarship. Not just necessarily, written scholarship, but our oral histories as well. I could not have done this project without the conversations that I had with his artist students that I worked with and the artists that I got to kind of learn about. But I also say this to say the very importance of purchasing catalogs too. So just a thought. When I was reading the catalog raisonné, there are two mirroring timelines that you'll find in the catalog, and one that focuses on his personal life, and the other that's a reception of his work. Everyone can hear me, right? Okay, all right, just want to make sure. And so I came across several entries in the life timeline starting in 1961 that wrote that Lawrence had wanted to travel to the African continent, but was initially denied a visa by the United States State Department. But in 1962, I was able to travel with some of his earlier paintings to the country, to Nigeria specifically. And then other insertions stated him having exhibitions in Nigeria with his wife, fellow artist Gwendolyn Knight, who I'll also speak a little bit about. They then traveled to Nigeria together in 1964 after selling their apartment to fund the trip. The final entries that precipitated my real excitement about learning about this were, quote, while in Nigeria, Lawrence completes paintings and drawings of African life and experiments with new painting techniques. It concludes with, quote, the solo exhibition of paintings and drawings created in Nigeria at Terry Dinton Foss Gallery. So I specifically talk about this because at this time I'm a PhD student. So I am desperately trying to finish my dissertation. And trying to research their collection, think about a project. I'm trying to figure out what's my name going to be in this art historical scholarship field. And I felt at that moment that I had really stumbled across information that kind of blew my mind. I will never claim to be an expert on Lawrence. I feel like I have learned more about him, and I'm continuing to always learn about him. But I was familiar with him. I knew of the Migration series, but that was really the only series I really knew. And so when I'm seeing these other stories about his life and this time in Nigeria, and I'm in the Arts of Global Africa department at the time, I've got things are percolating. I'm really excited about this discovery. So on this really got me interested and excited about this moment. Which led me to learning about Black Orpheus, which I'll get into as well, and the Mbari Artists and Writers Club. And this is a timeline that we made for the exhibition when we originated it, and just gives you, again, a bit of knowledge about not just Lawrence, but as I'll talk about also the kind of parallel arts practices that are happening some of the parallel arts practices happening on the African continent at the same time. So I'm learning about Black Orpheus, which I will get into, the Mbari Artists and Writers Club. And this is the covers of Black Orpheus. And this was a journal and an organization that Lawrence was in touch with, but as well, as I said, it's happening on the African continent. And at the time, because I was a graduate student, I really wasn't able to make the project what I wanted it to be, really for two reasons. One, I was trying to finish my dissertation. But then secondly, I also knew as I'm researching Lawrence and his time there, I realized the project was much bigger than just him. And that it needed more time, it needed more kind of marination, if you will, to really figure out what could this be, because I knew there was a lot there and I needed the time to kind of figure that out. So it really wasn't until I joined at the Chrysler in 2017 that I was really able to start thinking about the exhibition that would ultimately become Black Orpheus, and I was able to apply for graduate research assistance from the Terra Foundation to go to Ibaliva House, which is an incredible Institute of African Art Practice that's in Bayreuth, Germany. I wouldn't have known that existed before my working on this project. I got to go to private collections in Brazil, travel to different institutions across the United States, and it just reminded me. I mean, I already knew, but it's when you have those moments where you're just like, there's so much there. There is so much incredible just collectors and artists and practices that we've just touched the very, very surface. And as part of the project, I was even able to have the museum acquire this work, Market Scene, from the Nigeria series that I will chat about for the Chrysler Museum's collection. So if you've not been to the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, it's a lot closer than you think. And you can go kind of check this out. So now let's get more in the details about what the project is about. So Black Orpheus, and I apologize, these images are not good, but they're scans of scans of scans. So Black Orpheus centers on three interrelated moments in time. The creation of the primary years of the arts and cultural journal Black Orpheus, which I just mentioned, which were mainly between 1957 and 67, though the journal extended on in iterations later. Which originated in Ibadan, Nigeria, and with the goal of promoting African literature on a global stage to show its relevancy and complexity in relation to European literature. The aforementioned journeys to Nigeria that Lawrence and his wife made, the resulting series that he did, and finally, a growing arts community throughout the cities of Nigeria created by the Mbari Artists and Writers Club, whose artists were trying to create art forms that honored traditional practices, but also incorporated Eurocentric methodologies. This period in the early to mid-1960s shows how artists were creating new, innovative approaches to art, often based around the socio-political environment that surrounded them. In Nigeria and other African countries at that time, their newly independent status from European colonial powers, mainly of England and France, inspired artists to create new visual forms reflecting their country's long history and modernist future, while Lawrence was adding to his existing oeuvre by observing and presenting African American life. And what you're going to see here so this is the Mbari location in Ibadan here on the bottom right. Yes. And then on the top left, hopefully you can actually see Lawrence in there. Again, so you have Uli Bayer on the far left, Lawrence next to him, Uche Okeke is in there, Bruce Honorbrook-Paya. So this is while Lawrence was visiting on his first visit, we'll also get into. So this is an image from the original exhibition at the Chrysler. And so the exhibition had 5 sections, which I'll go over. And this is the beginning section, which is Jacob Lawrence in Nigeria. And so this was incredible because, as I'll kind of discuss, this was the first time this series was presented in its totality since it was first shown. And there were works that were made after he had returned from Nigeria. So there was about a dozen that was made while he was there, and then several others after. And I was even able to find original letters that were included. So it was wonderful situation. So again, this presented the Nigeria series, but also included examples of his oeuvre from his earlier practices that had thematic relationships and connections from the previous 2 decades. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Lawrence's first journey to Nigeria came in 1962 when he traveled to Lagos, which was then still capital, Osogbo and Ibadan, which was also the kind of the cultural hub of Nigeria at that time because of the University of Ibadan. And that's where he actually presented his war series and his migration series. The trip as you can see, so the trip was short, lasting only 10 days, but was really incredibly impactful to the artists because Lawrence had been studying African art through visiting the collections at MoMA, at the Met, and researching at the Schomburg Library. His exhibition in Lagos was held at the West African headquarters for the American Society for African Culture. He and his wife were both members of. The group promoted African art and culture to primarily African American audiences and the wider American populace through art salons of visiting artists, lectures, and book exchanges. And so this is one of the newsletters from the exhibition when they were opening the center. So conversely, Lawrence, oh, sorry, no, go back. Conversely, with Lawrence's exhibition and the center's presence in Lagos, AMSAC was also promoting African American culture and utilizing American cultural diplomacy tactics to Nigerian audiences through similar means. AMSAC was the American affiliate of the Société Africaine de Culture, SAC, which was founded by Alain Diop, who was a Senegalese intellectual who had previously founded the Francophone cultural journal Présence Africaine. Wait, hold on. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, there we go. And so SAC's aim was in promoting African culture internationally. Okay, back to the slide, right. Now, while Lawrence's exhibition was on view, one of the Mbari Club founders, which is Uli Bayer, as I said, who is on the far left, who is a German expat and scholar of African literature, requested that the show be extended and traveled to the space he had organized in Ibadan, where the Mbari Artists and Writers Club were operating. Lawrence's work and that of artist William H. Johnson was also reviewed in the group's journal, Black Orpheus, in 1963. So just to make sure I'm clear with y'all. So the journal was done by the group, but the journal actually came first. And then the group started it. So it was Bayer kind of founded it with certain artists. The journal had Lawrence's work reviewed in the journal, which then resulted in him having the show in 1962. So just wanted to be clear because it gets a little confusing with all the dates and the fact that you've got different things happening. So the local press at the time had really reviewed the exhibition favorably, and the artist was actually able to meet a few of the members, which would eventually result in his second visit in 1964, and the second time was for 8 months with his wife, Gwendolyn Knight, joining him. Both artists created images from their time there, though Knight's has yet to be located, unfortunately. And it is really my hope with this exhibition and just getting the word out there that not only does her practice as an artist in her own right become much more widely acknowledged and recognized, but also that there's further research to hopefully maybe finding those work. There is a rumor that she may have destroyed those images after, not being happy with them, but I hope that's not the case. So now, before I get further into his time in Nigeria, I want to actually take us back a few decades because I want us to remember that this journey to go to the African continent in the 1960s didn't just happen coincidentally. He's been thinking about this journey for years. As a child and a young adult, he was taught by an older generation of African American artists, such as Augusta Savage, who led the Harlem Community Arts Center, and Charles Alston. Moreover, living in Harlem in the 1930s, he was aware and often interacted with artists and writers active during the decades prior, which we know as the Harlem Renaissance. Excuse me, I'll be clearing my throat and drinking water to this. Elaine Locke, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and Aaron Douglas were living and or active in the same neighborhood as Lawrence, and his teachers knew of each other and assisted in sharing that knowledge. In addition, one of his best teachers was not a person, but a place. the Arthur Schomburg Collection on 135th Street, which was the local branch, which is still the local branch of the New York Public Library system. The vast collection of books, objects, and access to highly knowledgeable librarians was incredibly invaluable. They also opened his mind to global possibilities before he had ever thought of the financial capacity to visit the places that he read about. So even before Lawrence ever set foot on the continent, he was engaged with its numerous cultures, languages, practices, and traditions. And the library is a theme that you will see throughout his practice because of how important not only the Schomburg Library is, but just the libraries and the knowledge in which we can get there and the importance of education. So I wanted to make sure that that was recognized. Continuing in his life in 1941, he married fellow artist Gwendolyn Knight, who was born in Barbados and was sent to live with close family friends who were also Barbadian in New York as a child. When she and her husband decided to requested to receive support from the State Department to go to Nigeria in 1964 and were initially denied. They weren't sure exactly where to turn, but they, Lawrence, being a very established artist at this time, had support from patrons, his dealer Edith Halpert. But what was interesting, the reason that they were denied was because Lawrence actually had an FBI file that suggested he was a communist sympathizer and that was associated with arts organizations that had communist ties. And this is obviously despite the fact of his service in the Coast Guard. So, however, and this is actually one of my favorite stories, due to his wife, Knight, being born in Barbados, which was still then a protectorate of the United States, of the United Kingdom, she was able to apply for a UK passport and visa, allowing them to travel to Nigeria. So because Nigeria had just gained its independence from the UK in 1960. So really, it's always the wives that make these things happen. And the other way in which I wanted to also mention this. So this painting here, again on the right here, is by Knight that I was able to also acquire for the Chrysler Museum. And this is a painting that she does decades after having left Barbados as a young child. Her mother was still there. She hadn't gone in a long, long time. And so these are just her memories that she is trying to capture within paint herself, like I said, a visual storyteller. But again, the power of she knew they needed to go. And she was able to help make that happen. And again, the importance of her as an artist, which has really yet to be widely acknowledged. She's had some small shows. It was really not until the 70s that her recognition, even though she was in the same art schools as Lawrence. That's where they met. They met through Augusta Savage, working together. So I just wanted to I always try and take a moment also recognize her and her contributions and the fact that she did actively kind of step back professionally because he was already so established and knew that people were more paying attention. But again, his body of work would not have happened without her. So, hey, girlfriend. Hey, girl, hey. So 2 years later, after their marriage, they were married in 41. In 1943, Lawrence was drafted into the U.S. Coast Guard during World War II. After his boot camp in Maryland, the artist was stationed in St. Augustine, Florida, where his notoriety as an artist was given no consideration. In fact, in letters wrote home to Gwen, he wrote, quote, "In the North, one hears much of democracy and the four freedoms. Down here, you realize that there are a very small percentage of people who try to practice democracy. Negroes need not be told what fascism is like because in the South, they know nothing else." His dealer at the time, again, as I said, Edith Halpert, got him reassigned from Florida to the U.S. Sea Cloud, with the help of Captain Skinner, as you know, which was a former yacht converted into a weather patrol vessel in the Atlantic. Initially classified as a steward mate, which the NAACP considered service in khaki. After joining the Sea Cloud, he was later reclassified as a specialist third class in the Public Relations Department, which allowed him to paint full-time as a combat artist. What made Lawrence's naval experience unique was that the Sea Cloud was the first interracial vessel within the armed services. So he was a widely recognized artist at this point. So Captain Skinner purposely selected him to be on this crew. And he wanted to experiment with a mixed race crew. And over the course of those 2 years, Lawrence regularly painted the everyday duties of his crew members. Oh, as you see here. Wrong way. Darn it. Okay. Yes. Okay. So we're seeing here Lawrence on the right with his image and embarkment, which is in the exhibition. Another image, number control 2. And then so we're seeing him, he not only is he showing men working, but he's showing, people cooking the meals, maintaining the pipes, handling the ropes. He's also showing them at rest and playing games together. And again, unfortunately, most of these images are lost. We're only seeing them through the printed reproductions when he had his initial exhibition, but they reflect the actuals, not only actual observations, but a hope of a triumphant future for Black and white workers, that they wouldn't just be collegial, but they would be friends and brothers, that they were all human together. So in showing, he would very specifically show in these rhythmic presentations of labor of, Black and white workers kind of in these, one after the other, working together, passing buckets of just material. So in doing that and showing the rhythm of these individuals, regardless of color, it would be a hopeful depiction of the mundane. Like can we just not work together and see each other as human beings? And so while he was on the Sea Cloud, he traveled to Trinidad, Egypt, and India, continuing his desire to know the world more deeply and to reflect humanity more profoundly. Though there are no paintings from these travels, he was able to see beyond his segregated home in the US to consider both unique aspects of different societies and yet how connected people were, and how yet connected people were despite different languages, practices, and religions. After his discharge in 1945, he began the War Series, which not only showed Black and white soldiers working together, but also in active fighting, which was incredibly unique. And in years prior, you would never see a Black soldier actually in combat. That was not what the Army wanted, or any of the armed services wanted to present. They wanted to really, because it took so long it wasn't even until the early 40s that you even had Black soldiers within the armed services. So to see them actually fighting and being intelligence officers or anything, saving, that was so kind of profound and unique. So what he's here, he's trying to show them, actively fighting, suffering injury, and just trying to survive the death of family members. It was about a shared experience of war, loss, resilience, and family that would resonate over a decade later, really 15, to the Nigerian audiences that saw these works in 1962, who had just had their own battles to overcome British colonialism. So Lawrence's work showed Nigerian viewers that challenges arise in Black populations worldwide. So we're going right. However, as I said, it was not until 1964 that Lawrence's wife would finally make a dream a reality and journey to Nigeria for an extended period to do what he had spent his career accomplishing, creating visual stories of African American life. From his earlier trips, he knew that traveling to the continent would be, quote, very stimulating, and as a result, any work produced from such a trip should be a contributing factor towards an even more positive attitude and understanding in the rest of the world toward Africa as a whole, end quote. While there, he created about a dozen images of Nigerian life in tempera and gouache, crayon, and pen and ink. And he covered really three main themes, which were marketplaces, as you're seeing here. And this is a 1966 work, but again, he still was very fascinated by the market scenes there. Nigerian women, you would also see, and spirituality. So, excuse me, Lawrence's Nigeria images continued his practice of focusing on Black life, but presented the distinctiveness of modern life in Nigeria. His painting, The Three Red Hats, depicts a Yoruba ritual tradition of an all-male society acting as an either gentle or harsh judge against citizens, hitting them with canes. And this is actually kind of spectacle promenade that still happens today. You will see it's an all male society. They will have completely kind of white garbs, and they will have different colored kind of cornstole hats, and they will have these very kind of light switches. And so people line up the streets, and they act almost as like kind of an intermediary between the spirit world and the human world. And so these figures, they're kind of, acting as like possibly the kind of possessed of the spirit. And so you don't know if a person is going to be kind of given loving, they get like a small little tap, or if they're just like, no, you're being horrible, and like you get a big slap. And so it's almost a way of kind of reminding people that the spirits are watching, the ancestors are paying attention to you. So don't think that we are not. And this work, Street to Mbari, is actually in the National Gallery. It's an absolutely incredible painting. So this image, Street to Mbari, really presents one of Lagos's densely packed urban markets, highlighting the patterns of fabrics sold by vendors and taking an almost extreme in his use of color and pattern to produce a narrative. Marketplaces were a popular theme, as I said, throughout the series, and he wrote back to friends that these spaces were, quote, visually the most exciting experiences. Everything you can imagine is sold there: goats, sheep, chickens, fruits, vegetables, clothes, hardware, etc. And even before I was working on this project, one of the reasons I even was very invested in it was because my dissertation topic, as I have mentioned before, that I did, was actually on photographic depictions of Lagos, Nigeria. So I spent several months in Lagos, and the markets are, I think, beyond comprehension on how large they are. I mean, they are larger than football fields, stadiums. I mean, they take up miles. The amount of commerce that happens in these places, they are a spectacle beyond belief. They are dynamic, they are overwhelming, they are vibrant, they are smelly. I mean, your body has a visceral reaction because you just kind of go like this. But they are incredible. And I actually got to go to one of the clothing markets, and I was with a friend, and we went to just hundreds and hundreds of stalls with 10, 12, 15 feet tall worth of just stacks of fabric. Miles, just a sea of pattern, a sea of color, a sea of pattern. And I wanted to get some fabric to get some clothes made. And my friend said, well, we can go to multiple. I said, absolutely not. We will go to one place because there are 6 hours worth of just looking at fabric in this one stall. So we went to one stall. I talked to the woman, and I was able to get some fabric. But it is, if you ever get the opportunity to go to West Africa, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Senegal, go to the markets. It is where life happens, and the women control it. They dominate. It's amazing. Um, but I also just like it, I just want to also take a moment to have you really inspect this painting, because if you think about the detail and the level in which Lawrence put this together, the design, the foregrounding, the background, in my opinion, you can feel the depth of what he's trying to show you. You can see the colors. You've got the women, carrying the fabric on their heads. They're carrying food on their heads. You've got chickens next to it. You got kids running around. I mean, it is controlled chaos, but it is chaos. But it is also something that I think we in the United States, especially in the time when this was so much more prevalent, is just something we're not used to. Like, he would make paintings in Harlem of the farmers market. So there's like these connections, but this is something new. And I think that was why he was so fascinated by it and wanted to really just document. He spent so much time kind of looking at these. So so I've talked about Lawrence and part of his exhibition. So now the exhibition itself continues with Artists of Eshegbo, which is this section. And this is where works by artists associated with the Mbari Club, and who also had many times were featured in Black Orpheus. So some had both an exhibition with the Mbari Club and were members, had articles in the journal, or vice versa. And so the journal was founded in 57, and then you had the club founded in 1961. And I'm just going to show this. Okay, let me see. Wait, you said I got to do this. And then, haha, worked. Okay, so this, I'm just going to do that. So the other thing I'm really proud of for this show was if you, the meat of the show, beyond the incredibleness of Lawrence, was the journals. Because, and I'll get more in detail about the history of it, but because you had some of the most incredible writing in those journals. I mean, it wasn't just articles like reviews on shows, it was poetry, it was short stories. And these were all by not like by West African, East African, Caribbean, Latin American writers, men and women, young people. Some of the earliest, some of the first English translations of Leopold Senghor's poetry were in these journals. And so it was so important to me to not only and honestly they're beautiful art pieces in of themselves because the covers were all designed by artists, so breathtaking. But so what I was able, and so it just, but these are, you can't find these journals anywhere, or if you do find them, they're usually in a museum or kind of university library system, and they're kind of, they're uh, I can say words. Yes, like encased together, and so you can't find loose copies, is what I was trying to say. We found a few on eBay, very expensive. We were able to find a private collector who had them. And so because I knew none of these journals together would really happen again, I had them all digitized. Like I had everything in there digitized because I just said, I don't know when these works will ever happen again in terms of just getting all this information. So again, it's just also say like, if you've got these old, those old journals and things like, don't throw them away. Just because there's so much information in there that I think we don't recognize anymore or utilize or think is important. And yet that first person research that I was luckily enough, like really taught the importance of, I'm not seeing, students that I'm working with really, like I'm having to tell them like, go to the library. I think don't come back until you look at microfiche and microfilm and every librarian by name, like, because it's just again that knowledge is just so critical. So that's sorry, my little soapbox of just the importance of that information. So Uli Bayer, who I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, traveled to the Sorbonne in Paris in 1960 for the First World Congress on Negro Artists and Writers, which was hosted by Alain Diop and Presence Africaine. So Bayer wanted to create an Anglophone complement to Presence Africaine and bring English translations of many of the same writers that were featured in Presence Africaine to English speakers, especially Senegalese poet Leopold Sédar Senghor, who eventually became the first president of Senegal. The journal was titled Black Orpheus after the title of the writer Jean-Paul Sartre's introduction to Senghor's poetry on negritude. Sartre compared Senghor's words to the Greek mythological epic of Orpheus, who traveled to the underworld and in return reclaiming his bride. The comparison suggested the work was, quote, a symbolic return to and revalidation of ancestral Africa. So again, just to stop and start again, just to be clear. So the First World Congress of African Artists and Writers was an absolutely epic moment in time. It was a global phenomenon where again, artists and writers from throughout the world came together to dialogue and to discuss and to really just be aware of each other as writers, as creatives, as scholars, as thinkers. And so this is hosted by Landube, this is hosted by Press Africaine, and it's predominantly Francophone, but not exclusively. And so then you've got Bayer, who's German, but already in Nigeria. So he goes and says, okay, the French folks got it. We got to make sure that we have an English version. So that's why Black Orpheus even came into being. And then the title came from this particular book by Jean-Paul Sartre, and then Leopold Senghor, which was the intro to Senghor's book on negritude. So if you know of the theory of negritude, which was, like I said, theorized through Senghor, Sartre writes about the intro to that, which helps create the First World Congress. With me? Okay, all right. It's been like, sometimes I forget, like you say this again and again, I'm just like, make sure everybody gets it. So in 1961, Bayer, along with a group of Nigerian artists and writers, including Uche Okeke and Wole Soyinka, I keep hitting the wrong button. Ah, okay. Founded the Mbari Club. And their goal was to have a space where young creatives could have a place for lively debate, produce and exhibit work. And essentially, it was an art salon that really was also an experimental laboratory for creativity. So they had restaurant in there as well, and they had dialogues. It was just, it was a way just to kind of think and converse and see like what's happening in the world. We're in this new moment where we are finally able to see our own creative heritage as Yoruba, as Hausa people, and feel validated in that, and not purely be told that you have no art history, you have no history, you have no real practice because it's not written down or it's not done in particular models. So, okay. So many of the artists that were a part of the club were either from the University College of Ibadan, where Bayer had taught, or the Nigerian College of Art and Technology, INCAS, which was in Zaria. And these are also an important mention. The majority of time I've been speaking about men, and because that's the predominant group number, but there were some very important women. We've already talked about Gwendolyn. Susan Wenger, whose work is here on the left. Colette Omagbai, who was one of the only female artists that was part of the INCAS group. And you also had Georgina Bayer, who was Bayer's second wife. And all of these women were incredibly impactful. There's a specific essay in the catalog that's just dedicated to them, because I wanted to make sure that that information was pulled out because they often get ignored within this tradition. And Suzanne particularly designed a lot of the covers for Black Orpheus, especially the early years. And we actually used and created these beautiful textiles and batik. And some of the designs that she used, we use as like the design for the actual show. So she gets a lot of important mention there. So in addition, back in 1962, a sister organization was founded by the Nigerian musician and playwright Duro Lapido in the trade city of Oshogbo, which was called Mbari Mbayo. So this is actually the Mbari Mbayo space. So this is the kind of second location for the Mbari Club, and that is Duro on the left in one of his kind of performances. So this space also became a true experimental hub because while Ibadan was really, because it was a university town, it had a lot of kind of the intellectuals were based there. Shugbo was really a port as a trade city. So you had a lot of people who were coming to take workshops there that were not formally trained. Maybe they'd be in assistantships. And so they really wanted to become more professional artists, and they were learning the different techniques there. So Twin 77, who you see here on the left, who is really considered an icon in modern African art, he was a dancer, he was also a musician, really Renaissance man. He learned printmaking, textile design, metalwork, and painting while learning at the Mbari Bio Club under Georgina Bayer. So so this is an example. He developed a really distinctive style. This is a sea ghost, which is really focused on Yoruba mythology and traditions. And he would paint on canvas, paper, wood. His work is so detailed, and again, these images are not the best, that you will learn his work out of most is very distinctive, and you can easily see just because it's usually very rectangular, and it almost kind of feels a little bit oh man, what is the childhood book um where the where the wild things are? Yes, see? Yes. So I mean, but like so you get that feeling of when you see his work, I always get that. That's the story that kind of goes in my head. And so there's all these kind of there's spirit figures and animals and but it's really incredible work. So hopefully you will see his works again. Okay, so we're going back again to the installation shots for the exhibition. So now we're getting into the Zaria Art Society, which presents so this was a group of artists that came out of the INCAS, the Nigerian College of Arts and Science in 1958. And some of its earliest members, like I mentioned, Uche Okeke and Bruce Anabrakpeya, were members of the Mbari Club and had some of their first professional exhibitions in the space in Ibadan. The society was founded to provide informal instruction um, amongst themselves and other students who wanted to learn about traditions outside of the Eurocentric model of INCAS art department. They were considered rebels. They were also referred to as the Zaria rebels, as they rejected the notion that Western art practices were the only correct form of studying and learning art history. And really, given there was this euphoria of Nigeria's pre-independence nationalism, Okeke himself had developed this theory of natural synthesis, where they advocated for the fusion of indigenous practices with some more useful Western ones to create a new model for art within this post-independence era. And so this is a later section, but so this is one of the last remaining sections across the African continent and beyond the African continent, which I had because I wanted to illustrate that Black Orpheus did not purely advocate for the works of its members and collaborators, but also across the African continent and beyond. But it was mostly Bayer's vision of contemporary art. So Bayer very much kind of acts as this kind of like floating ghost because he made things he was he made a lot of the initial things happen. And so a lot of things are based on his initial vision, which was very particular. And that the idea where he was really only focused on artists who were trying to really bring Western and kind of non-Western art practices together and beautiful, incredible works. But if you weren't doing something like that, you weren't really shown. So there's still very much biases within the journal and what exhibitions were really shown. But for Bayer particularly, he kind of quote, artists whose work showed a more formal or conceptual synthesis of modern avant-garde techniques and the sense of enigma he identified with indigenous art and religions in Africa. So he had a very kind of, particular idea on what contemporary art at the time by young African artists should be. And that was what he promoted and really only promoted. And so so for example, you've got the Skandar Boghossian and Ibrahim El-Salahi, who were Sudanese and Ethiopian artists, and working at Howard for Boghossian, and so again, they were really bringing like the practice that they had developed as young men, but then they're also using paint. But for El-Salahi in particular, he was very much initially like a portrait painter when he first came to Europe to study, and then going back, no one took him seriously, so he had to really reconceptualize what he was creating. So that's why he started really looking at calligraphy and looking at and painting with a lot of browns, the tones that he was seeing back at home. So really thinking about the relationships that he was building. And I'm gonna move it along a little bit here. So this gives you just a little bit more detail on some of these works, artists, again, especially coming from Northern and East Africa, who are really delving into calligraphy, but not as purely a writing form, but the beauty of the line, the beauty of the shape, and how much in, calligraphic forms, each each shape, each line has a purpose and an intention. But because it can be done in so many different ways, how can you not just see the beauty, like how can you not just break apart that and just see the beauty within it? And so Chabrin himself was very much thinking about that, just that essence of the curve and that shape and really what that meant. And so, and this was it was Valente Malangkatanga, who was from Angola, and Malangkatanga was he would create these incredibly large images, again, really based on because the Portuguese were in control, utilizing the kind of traditional stories that he had been taught, but kind of undermining it with the Catholicism that he's taught in school and the Portuguese language, but also thinking about the issues and the problems with Catholicism and the kind of dangers of the spirits kind of coming together and like who's fighting for power and for control. So, and so then so outside of the African continent, you had artists from Brazil, India, and even Japan. That was also featured in the journal. And so the sculptures here in the center are by Agnaldo Manuel dos Santos, who was a Brazilian artist and was self-taught sculptor of wooden figures that referenced West African imagery, Catholic ex votos, and carancas, which were like figures on the front of these kind of wooden heads that were on the front of barges and acted as amulets against the spirits. You also had works like Avinish Chandra, who painted abstract landscapes and human stakes through kind of circular patterns and techniques. So going back, it's hard to see, but William H. Johnson's work are in the images and the prints and the drawings behind Agnaldo dos Santos. So the last kind of sections here as part of the show were really to emphasize the fact that the journal, in its first issue, it stated, quote, "We hope to continue with our own modest means the excellent work begun by the World Congress of Black Writers and by the French literary journal Présence Africaine, bringing together authors writing in different languages to a fruitful exchange of ideas." So again, it was about always from the very beginning showing the fact that these artists are everywhere. And we need to recognize that and show that the caliber of what they were creating was on par with anything coming out of the West. And he really wanted to kind of promote that and emphasize that. And so, despite kind of differences in, like I said, languages or kind of unique characteristics. So ultimately, that was the exhibition. And, this to me, like I said, is the beginning. There's so much from this show that I'm still thinking about. Every artist, honestly, in that show deserves their own solo retrospective. There's so much more research to be done. AMSAC as an organization, I still feel I really want to do a whole project just on that. So there's still so much more really to be done and to be thought of. But I hope this gives you a introduction into some other areas about Lawrence's life and practice, and introduces you to some of the other incredible artists out there that I hope you take a moment to learn more about. So thank you so much for listening. I greatly appreciate it. I am happy to answer any questions, and I was told to say that for those in Zoom land, hey Zoom, please ask your question and wait till the mic comes. Oh, that's what, no, sorry. So sorry, that's what it was. Haha. For those of us here, wait till the mic comes to you so the people in Zoom land can hear you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. Please. Yes. Oh, here comes the mic. Yes. Thank you so much for waiting.
This has just been fantastic. After his time in Africa, what happened with Jacob Lawrence?
So I mean, a lot, but
and I'm sorry, did his time in Africa influence what he did later as well?
Yes. So as I mentioned, so some of the Nigeria series were shown for the ones that he made there. So he had a show in 1965 with Terry Dinton-Foss. So that showed that series, which was very well received. And then within a couple years later, he's added more works to that, but they were never shown again. All the works really got sold. So what's interesting is that I think the reason we know so much about the Migration series was because it was really only split to two institutions. It's kept intact, but the majority of his work was, sold individually. But he was so prolific that because people are honestly, we over the course of the show, we found two collectors who had works we didn't know where they were. So now at least I know where they all are. But he kind of continued looking, I think, at market scenes, at urban spaces. But in terms of like what Africa as it is an influence for him, his color palette got a bit more vibrant for a while. But he still kind of retained his signature style. He didn't really change so much, but just continued really to work as an artist, in New York, and then eventually they moved to Seattle, where he resided there, and was teaching as well. And then Gwen also, again, had a practice, but there's very few works known that have been published. And so she started kind of having more shows starting in the 70s until her later years, but still very much, an active work. And again, there's so many other series. He did whole series on builders and the libraries and fables and, the Hiroshima series. So, again, just an incredibly prolific artist throughout his entire career.
We have a question from Zoom.
Okay.
Someone would like to know, from the initial idea to the opening day, how long did it take to put together this exhibition?
So I was a fellow at Newark 2015 to 16. So that's where the genesis of the show started. We opened the show October 2022. Yeah. So part of that was I needed to get a job. So I finished the dissertation, got the job at the Chrysler, and that's when I was really able to start thinking about it. Because initially, what I thought I would try and do is just do Lawrence's work, just try and see if we could find the just try and find the works. And then again, I realized, no, this is bigger than that. And frankly, I would not have been able to even try to attempt to pull it off when I was a fellow, because the amount of time it took me just to find the works. What I was very lucky with, and another reason why I think catalog raisonnés are so important, is because Lawrence's estate as an artist is managed by a gallery. Come on, don't embarrass yourself. It'll come to me in a second. But the gallery not only was there catalog raisonné, but the estate has a gallery. So they also had records of who works had been sold to or they thought had been sold to. So I was then able to work with the gallery to start tracking people down, and we were sending cold emails. I sent letters to, I was just like, does anyone know where this work is? Do you have it? And so like things had been sold and sold again. We found one of the works was in Alaska. Some works came from Canada. So the amount of time it just took to find where things were part of the reason of that. And then also the pandemic happened while we were kind of finishing things up. So there are a lot of kind of outlying things that made it worked. And then just trying to also bring in the artists from the African continent. Again, I was very lucky in that a lot of the works came from Eva Leva House, so they were very generous lenders. But otherwise, I would have there are major collectors of African art, both United States, Europe, but mostly they are on the African continent. And the biggest issue that I think we don't talk enough about in terms of doing international shows, and especially now, is the cost of shipping. Honestly, that's one of the biggest issues. It's the cost of insuring these works and shipping the works and creating them. And so trying to have had to get these works from different collectors throughout the African continent, I think would have made this show almost impossible to do. So I was very lucky I had one major collector that had a lot of things. And I had group of collectors out of Sao Paulo, Brazil. So I had like clusters that made it much easier to kind of bring things together. But there were still things I was trying to find that I wasn't able, that I would have loved to put in. I wanted definitely to get more like a beautiful Susan Wenger tapestry. Couldn't get in touch with the foundation. So there were things that just made it more difficult to get certain works. But again, I just it's another really important reason why artists having and collectors having records. Like what do you have? Who did you have? Who did you sell it to? Does the artist that you collect, do they have a gallery representation? Do they know that you have it? Because you also never know when someone like myself will go like, I heard you had a thing. Might you be willing to let me borrow it? And I think the other reason why things took a while for me was I was also building trust with the collectors. I wanted to make sure that they knew I was serious about this project, that I would take care of the work, that I would take care of the story, and present what they owned and what they loved in a way that was dignified and important. So that's something else that I think is really important for curators and scholars to do, is to make sure that you as collectors and audiences feel that we are respecting what you're doing, and vice versa, that there's a mutual connection between that. And that takes time to build, especially if you're a collector who's not used to ever lending. So that was a lot of it, just having to explain, how does it work? What do you do? What's the paperwork? It just takes time to do those things. So what was that, 6 years? 7? Yep, 7 years. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Who would you name, or is anyone in particular you would cite who is working today, who you feel are the heirs to the Jacob Lawrence tradition?
Ooh. I got to think about that one. Because, well, the reason I have to think about it is because, you know what? Actually, I don't. Maleko Magotsi. He is a Botswanan artist. He teaches at Yale. His work is also coincidentally in Giants. But the reason I say that is because he works in a very, well, he works multi-paneled. His images are, they tell a story like Lawrence's, but very differently, in the sense of it really, like, how do I even say it? He draws you in. So Lawrence definitely, I think, draws you in. I mean, the parallels are, they are captivating creators. What Maleko does differently, his works are huge. So the one work that we have in Giants is 22 panels. Each panel is what is it? I think 13 by 13 feet. So half of one work would take up this room. And the level of complexity that he puts into his paintings, one panel would take you years just to dissect. And the fact that he's also thinking about, and he also does a beautiful way of incorporating the languages of Botswana and the cultural traditions of Southern Africa, that if you are not from there, you won't catch. And he does that purposefully, because he wants us to think about different types of knowledge, what knowledge we know, and what it means when you don't have access to that knowledge. And then someone else would go like, oh, that's what they're saying there, because they have that inner knowledge that others don't. So just for everyone to know, so Meleko Magotsi is spelled Meleko Mogsoki. Wait, wait, shoot, Mog. I think so. Mogski. I think, yes. So I would look up his work as one to really think about.
This will be our last question for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm curious, I'm going out to Seattle and have good friends there. Being that he taught there, I wondered where he taught and if there's any collector or institution or any place in Seattle that has.
The Seattle Art Museum. They have a very large number of Lawrence's. I know some galleries are named after him. I believe he taught at the University of Seattle. I would have to double check that. And then another artist that I will make you aware of. And as soon as, okay, come on. I got this. I don't remember. What is Barbara's last name? Okay, so I'm gonna need a little help from the audience. This is the participatory part of the program. Claire Oliver Gallery in New York works with an artist. Her name is, and I'm picturing her face, her first name is Barbara. She was a student of Lawrence's. She's an incredible artist. If someone could look up her last name so I don't embarrass myself more. But Barbara works in incredible. She's a printmaker. She is a glass artist. She's an installation artist. I just need to get her last name. So then, thank you, Barbara Earl Thomas. Yes, Barbara Earl Thomas. And she is in Seattle. So I don't know if she has any shows up, but I would look at also her work just as another, asking about like taking on Lawrence's legacy. She's another one in a very different set of mediums and is an incredible artist and just a credible person. And she also has gallery representation if you're interested in looking at her work. So yes. Well, I was told that was our last question. So again, I just want to say thank you all so much for coming this evening and for letting me speak. And I hope to see you in New York. Please come to the Brooklyn Museum. Please go to Newark. Also, please go to the Chrysler. And also, please continue to support Hillwood Museums and Gardens and all the other amazing museums that are in the DMV area, because we need all of it. Oh, sorry. One super quick thing. So I didn't do it, but you should go see it. My colleague, Catherine Morris and Delilah Scruggs co-curated the Elizabeth Catlett show that's at the National Gallery. So if you have not seen that, I just want to plug that because it's a gorgeous show. And I would recommend, go and see that as well. So thank you. I'll end it there.
And please join us in the lobby for a book signing.